Bikers laugh at a man's old motorcycle moments later. They're fleeing in panic. In the quiet town of Willowbrook, the roar of motorcycle engines shattered the peaceful afternoon. The Vipers, a notorious biker gang known for their intimidating presence and disregard for the law, rolled into the main street, striking fear into the hearts of the residents. As they parked their gleaming bikes outside the local diner, a humble figure caught their attention. Elijah, an elderly man with weathered skin and kind eyes, sat astride an old, worn-out motorcycle. Razor, the burly leader of the Vipers, sauntered over to Elijah, his voice dripping with contempt. "Well, well, well," he sneered. "Look what we have here, boys. Grandpa thinks he's a biker." The other Vipers gathered around, their laughter cruel and mocking. They took turns hurling insults at Elijah, belittling his age and humble possessions. Elijah remained calm, his eyes filled with a quiet strength. "I may not have a fancy bike like yours, but I've been riding longer than you've been alive, son." Razor's face twisted into a scowl, his pride wounded by Elijah's defiance. The Vipers continued their taunts, unaware that Elijah was connected to someone far more powerful than they could imagine. Miles away, in a secluded cabin nestled in the woods, Silas received a phone call. He listened intently as he heard about the Vipers' arrival and their mistreatment of Elijah. Silas was a legend in the biker community, known for his unwavering sense of justice and his ability to command respect from even the most hardened outlaws. He had long ago left the life of a nomad behind, choosing to watch over Willowbrook from afar. As Silas hung up the phone, he knew he could no longer remain a silent observer. The Vipers' cruelty towards Elijah had set something in motion, and Silas knew he had to intervene. He made his way to his garage, where his classic Harley-Davidson awaited him. The bike was a testament to Silas's skill and dedication, lovingly maintained and customized over the years. Silas swung his leg over the seat and kicked the engine to life, feeling a sense of purpose wash over him. He rode towards Willowbrook, the wind whipping through his graying hair, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Silas knew that the Vipers were about to learn a valuable lesson, one that would challenge their false bravado and show them the true meaning of strength and honor. As he navigated the winding roads, Silas reflected on his own past, the trials and tribulations that had shaped him into the man he was today. He had seen the destructive power of unchecked ego and the pain it could inflict on others. Silas had vowed to use his influence to protect the innocent and guide the misguided. And now, he knew that his skills were needed more than ever. The sun began to set as Silas approached the outskirts of Willowbrook, painting the sky in hues of orange and red. The town lay before him, its streets quiet and unassuming, belying the tension that simmered beneath the surface. Silas knew that the Vipers' presence had shaken the community, but he also knew that the townspeople had a strength within them, waiting to be awakened. As he rode into town, Silas's mind was focused on the task at hand. He knew that confronting the Vipers would not be easy, but he was prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Silas had a plan, one that would not only teach the Vipers a lesson, but also inspire the townspeople to stand up for themselves and reclaim their community. The stage was set for a showdown between two opposing forces: the Vipers, with their false sense of power and cruelty, and Silas, a beacon of justice and honor. The fate of Willowbrook hung in the balance, and Silas knew that he would stop at nothing to protect the town and its people from the Vipers' reign of terror. As Silas rode into Willowbrook, his arrival did not go unnoticed. The townspeople, who had long heard whispers of the legendary biker, watched in awe as he navigated the streets with a commanding presence. Silas paid little attention to the stares and murmurs, his focus solely on the task at hand. He made his way to Elijah's house, where he found the elderly man sitting on his porch, his weathered hands clasped in his lap. Elijah looked up as Silas approached, a glimmer of recognition in his eyes. "Silas," he said, his voice thin but steady. "I knew you'd come." Silas dismounted his bike and walked over to Elijah, placing a comforting hand on the old man's shoulder. "I heard about what happened with the Vipers," Silas said, his voice low and reassuring. "I'm here to make things right." Elijah nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "I never doubted that for a second, my friend. But be careful. These vipers, they're not like the ones you've dealt with before. They have no respect for anyone or anything." Silas's jaw tightened, a steely resolve in his eyes. "They'll learn respect one way or another. I'll make sure of that." As news of Silas's arrival spread through the town, the vipers caught wind of the development. Razor, the gang's leader, was furious. He saw Silas as a threat to his power, a challenge to his authority. Razor gathered his men, his voice dripping with venom as he addressed them. "Listen up, boys," Razor snarled. "We've got a problem. Some old-timer thinks he can come into our town and tell us what to do. Well, I say we show him who's boss around here." The vipers cheered, their faces twisted into cruel sneers. They revved their engines, ready to confront Silas and assert their dominance. Razor led the charge, his eyes blazing with a dangerous intensity. Meanwhile, Silas had gathered a small group of townspeople who had grown tired of living in fear. They looked to him for guidance, their faces etched with a mix of hope and trepidation. Silas addressed the group, his voice steady and commanding. "I know you're all afraid," Silas said, his gaze sweeping over the assembled crowd. "But fear is what gives the vipers their power. It's time we take that power back. It's time we show them that this town belongs to us, not to a bunch of bullies on bikes." The townspeople nodded, their resolve growing stronger with each passing moment. They knew that standing up to the vipers would not be easy, but with Silas by their side, they felt a newfound sense of courage. As the vipers rode through the streets, their engines roaring like angry beasts, Silas and the townspeople stood their ground. They formed a human wall, their arms linked, their faces set in determination. Razor and his men came to a stop, their eyes narrowing as they took in the sight before them. Well, Razor sneered. "Look what we have here, the old man and his little army of sheep." Silas stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "This ends now, Razor. You and your men have terrorized this town long enough. It's time for you to leave." Razor laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the streets. "And who's going to make us? You and your pathetic little band of followers." Silas smiled, a quiet confidence radiating from him. "No, Razor. You're going to leave because you've finally met someone who isn't afraid of you. Someone who knows that true strength comes from standing up for what's right, not from intimidation and violence." The vipers shifted uneasily, their bravado beginning to crack under the weight of Silas's words. Razor's face contorted with rage, his fists clenching at his sides. "You have no idea who you're messing with, old man," he growled. Silas's eyes locked with Razor's, a silent battle of wills unfolding between them. "I know exactly who I'm messing with," Silas replied, his voice unwavering. "A coward who hides behind a facade of toughness because he's too afraid to face the truth about himself." The tension in the air was palpable, the townspeople holding their breath as they watched the confrontation unfold. They knew that the fate of their community hung in the balance, and that Silas was their last hope for a brighter future. As the standoff between Silas and the vipers intensified, the townspeople of Willowbrook watched with bated breath. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the low rumble of the vipers' motorcycles. Razor, the gang's leader, glared at Silas with a mixture of anger and contempt, his pride wounded by the old biker's defiance. Silas stood tall, his resolve unwavering in the face of the vipers' aggression. He knew that this moment would define the future of Willowbrook, and he was determined to see justice prevail. The townspeople, emboldened by Silas's presence, began to step forward, their faces set in determination. Razor's eyes darted from Silas to the growing crowd, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. He had always relied on fear to maintain his power, but now, faced with a united front, he began to realize the limits of his influence. The other vipers, sensing their leader's hesitation, shifted uneasily on their bikes. Silas seized the moment, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "This is your last chance, Razor," he said, his tone calm but firm. "Leave now and never come back. If you stay, you'll have to face the consequences of your actions. Razor's jaw clenched, his pride warring with the growing realization that he was outnumbered and outmatched. He revved his engine, a last-ditch attempt to intimidate the townspeople, but they stood their ground, their eyes locked on Silas. In that moment, Silas knew that the tide had turned. He stepped forward, his hand outstretched in a gesture of peace. "It doesn't have to be this way, Razor," he said, his voice softer now. "You have a choice. You can continue down this path of destruction, or you can choose to be a better man." Razor stared at Silas's hand, a war raging within him. For a fleeting moment, a glimmer of something akin to hope flickered in his eyes. But then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by a hardened resolve. Razor gunned his engine, his tires screeching as he tore through the crowd, his gang following close behind. The townspeople jumped out of the way, their hearts pounding as the Vipers sped past them. Silas watched them go, a sad smile playing on his lips. He knew that change wouldn't come easy, but he also knew that this moment marked the beginning of a new era for Willowbrook. As the sound of the Vipers' engines faded into the distance, the townspeople turned to Silas, their eyes shining with gratitude and respect. They knew that without him, they would still be living in fear, their lives governed by the whims of a cruel and ruthless gang. Silas looked out over the sea of faces, his heart swelling with pride. "Today we took a stand," he said, his voice ringing out clear and strong. "Today we showed that we are stronger together than we ever could be alone. And that's a lesson that the Vipers will never forget." The townspeople erupted into cheers, their voices joining together in a chorus of celebration. They hugged each other, tears streaming down their faces as they reveled in the feeling of unity and triumph. As the sun began to set over Willowbrook, casting a golden glow over the town, Silas knew that his work was far from over. The Vipers may have fled, but the scars they left behind would take time to heal. Silas vowed to stay by the townspeople's side, to guide them as they rebuilt their lives and their community. In the days and weeks that followed, Silas became a fixture in Willowbrook, his presence a constant reminder of the strength and resilience that existed within each and every one of them. He taught them that true power came from within, from the courage to stand up for what was right and the compassion to help those in need. And as the town began to thrive once more, the memory of the Vipers faded into the background, a distant reminder of a darker time. But the lessons they learned from Silas would stay with them forever, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. Years later, the story of Silas and the Vipers would become a legend in Willowbrook, passed down from generation to generation. It would serve as a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope and courage could light the way forward, and that the strength of a community could overcome even the greatest of challenges. In the aftermath of the Vipers' departure, Willowbrook began the slow process of healing. The physical scars left behind by the gang's reign of terror were easy to see, from the broken windows and graffiti-covered walls to the empty storefronts that lined the main street. But the emotional scars, the ones that ran deep within the hearts of the townspeople, would take longer to mend. Silas knew that his work had only just begun. He had driven the Vipers away, but now he had to help the people of Willowbrook rebuild their lives and their community. He started by reaching out to the most vulnerable members of the town, the ones who had suffered the most under the Vipers' rule. There was Mrs. Johnson, the elderly widow who had been forced to hand over her meager savings to the gang in exchange for protection. Silas helped her file a police report and connected her with a local charity that could provide her with the support she needed. Then there was Tommy, the young boy who had always dreamed of owning a motorcycle, but had been too afraid to even look at one since the Vipers had taken over. Silas took him under his wing, teaching him the ins and outs of motorcycle maintenance and showing him that not all bikers were like the Vipers. Slowly but surely, Willowbrook began to heal. The townspeople came together, united in their determination to rebuild their community and create a better future for themselves and their children. They organized community cleanup days, planting flowers in the park and repainting the storefronts that had been vandalized by the Vipers. Silas was there every step of the way, offering his guidance and support wherever it was needed. He helped the local police department establish a neighborhood watch program, ensuring that the town would never again fall prey to the likes of the Vipers. As the weeks turned into months, Willowbrook began to thrive once more. New businesses opened up, bringing life and vitality back to the main street. The park was filled with children playing and families picnicking, their laughter ringing out across the green grass. And at the center of it all was Silas, the man who had saved Willowbrook from the brink of destruction. He became a beloved figure in the town, his name spoken with reverence and gratitude by all who knew him. But Silas knew that his work was not yet done. He had heard rumors of other gangs like the Vipers operating in nearby towns and cities. He knew that he could not rest until he had ensured that no other community would suffer the same fate as Willowbrook. And so, one day, Silas packed up his belongings and prepared to leave Willowbrook behind. He had taught the townspeople everything he could, and now it was time for them to stand on their own 2 feet. As he rode out of town, the sun setting behind him, Silas knew that he had made a difference. He had shown the people of Willowbrook that they were stronger than they ever could have imagined, and that true power came from within. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready for the challenge. For Silas, this was not the end of the journey, but rather the beginning of a new chapter in his life. And as he rode off into the distance, the people of Willowbrook watched him go, their hearts filled with gratitude and respect for the man who had saved their town. They knew that they would never forget him, and that his legacy would live on in the strength and resilience of their community. Years later, when the children of Willowbrook asked their parents about the legend of Silas and the Vipers, they would hear a story of courage and hope, of the power of one man to change the course of history. And they would know that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, they too had the strength within them to overcome any obstacle and build a better world for themselves and for generations to come. As Silas rode away from Willowbrook, his heart was heavy with the knowledge of the challenges that lay ahead. He had heard whispers of other gangs like the Vipers, groups of lost souls who had turned to violence and intimidation as a way of life. Silas knew that he could not rest until he had brought hope and justice to every community that suffered under the weight of such cruelty. He rode for days, stopping only to rest and gather information about the towns he passed through. He listened to the stories of the people he met, hearing tales of fear and oppression that echoed the experiences of Willowbrook. And with each story, Silas's resolve grew stronger. Finally, he arrived in a small town called Oakdale, a community that had been ravaged by a gang known as the Reapers. The Reapers were even more ruthless than the Vipers, ruling through sheer terror and brutality. The people of Oakdale lived in constant fear, afraid to even leave their homes lest they incur the wrath of the gang. Silas knew that he had to act fast. He reached out to the local law enforcement, offering his assistance in bringing the Reapers to justice. At first, the police were skeptical, unwilling to trust an outsider with such a dangerous task. But as Silas shared his experiences in Willowbrook and his knowledge of the biker world, they began to see him as a valuable ally. Together, Silas and the Oakdale Police Department worked to gather evidence against the Reapers. They interviewed witnesses, collected surveillance footage, and built a case that would stand up in court. And all the while, Silas worked to inspire the people of Oakdale, showing them that they too had the power to stand up against their oppressors. It was a long and difficult road, but in the end, the Reapers were brought to justice. The people of Oakdale celebrated in the streets, tears of joy streaming down their faces as they embraced one another. And at the center of it all was Silas, the man who had given them back their hope and their freedom. But even as he basked in the glow of victory, Silas knew that his work was far from over. There were still other communities out there, still other gangs that needed to be brought to heel. And so, with a heavy heart but a clear sense of purpose, Silas once again set out on the open road. He traveled from town to town, city to city, always seeking out those who needed his help. He became a legend in his own right, a symbol of hope and justice for all those who had been beaten down by the cruelty of the world. And though the road was long and the battles were hard-fought, Silas never wavered in his commitment to his cause. He knew that every victory, no matter how small, was a step towards a brighter future for all. Years turned into decades and still Silas rode on. His hair grew gray and his body grew weary, but his spirit remained as strong as ever. And always, he carried with him the memories of Willowbrook and the people he had helped along the way. In the end, Silas knew that his legacy would live on long after he was gone. He had shown the world that one person could make a difference, that hope and courage could overcome even the darkest of evils. And he knew that as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, there would always be hope for a better tomorrow. And so, as he rode off into the sunset one last time, Silas knew that he had lived a life well lived. He had fought the good fight, and he had made the world a better place, one community at a time. And though he would never seek fame or glory for himself, he knew that his name would be remembered by those whose lives he had touched, a shining beacon of hope in a world that all too often seemed shrouded in darkness. Years had passed since Silas's fateful encounter with the Vipers in Willowbrook, but the memory of that day still burned bright in his mind. He had seen the depths of human cruelty, the way that fear and intimidation could break the spirit of even the strongest community. But he had also seen the power of hope and resilience, the way that a single spark of courage could ignite the flames of change. Now, as he rode through the countryside, Silas found himself reflecting on all that he had learned in his years on the road. He had seen the best and the worst of humanity, had fought battles both large and small. And through it all, he had held fast to the belief that goodness would always triumph in the end. As he crested a hill, Silas saw a familiar sight in the distance. The town of Willowbrook, nestled in the valley below. It had been years since he had last set foot in the town, but the memories came flooding back as if it were yesterday. He rode into town, his arrival causing a stir among the locals. Word quickly spread that Silas, the legendary biker who had saved Willowbrook from the clutches of the Vipers, had returned at last. As he dismounted his bike outside the old diner, Silas was greeted by a sea of familiar faces. There was Mrs. Johnson, the elderly widow who had once been too afraid to leave her home. There was Tommy, the young boy who had dreamed of owning a motorcycle of his own. And there, at the center of it all, was Elijah, the old man who had first set Silas on his path all those years ago. Silas felt a lump form in his throat as he took in the scene before him. These were the people he had fought for, the ones who had given him a reason to keep going when the road had seemed too long and the battles too hard. And now, seeing them here, thriving and happy, he knew that it had all been worth it. Over the next few days, Silas found himself drawn into the rhythm of life in Willowbrook once again. He spent his days catching up with old friends, sharing stories of his adventures on the road. And in the evenings, he would sit on the porch of Elijah's old house, watching the sun set over the hills and reflecting on all that had changed since he had last been here. But even as he basked in the warmth of Willowbrook's embrace, Silas knew that his time here was drawing to a close. There were still other communities out there that needed his help, still other battles to be fought. And so, with a heavy heart but a clear sense of purpose, he began to make his preparations to leave once more. On his last night in town, Silas found himself sitting alone at the old diner, nursing a cup of coffee and lost in thought. Suddenly, he heard the roar of a motorcycle engine outside, and he looked up to see a familiar figure striding through the door. It was Razor, the former leader of the Vipers, looking older and wearier than Silas had ever seen him. For a moment, the two men simply stared at each other, the weight of their shared history hanging heavy in the air between them. Finally, Razor spoke. "I never thought I'd see you again," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "After everything that happened, I didn't think you'd ever come back to this place." Silas smiled sadly. "I had to," he said. "This town, these people, they're a part of me now. I couldn't stay away forever." Razor nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and understanding. "I've had a lot of time to think about what happened back then," he said. "About the choices I made, the people I hurt. And I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for everything." Silas reached out and clasped Razor's hand in his own. "I know," he said softly, "but it's never too late to make things right. You've got a second chance now, Razor. Don't waste it." Razor nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. And in that moment, Silas knew that his work in Willowbrook was truly done. He had not only saved the town from the Vipers all those years ago, but he had also planted the seeds of change in the heart of his former enemy. And as he rode away from Willowbrook once more, Silas knew that those seeds would continue to grow and flourish long after he was gone. For he had learned that true strength came not from the power of the fist, but from the power of the heart. And in Willowbrook, and in all the communities he had touched along the way, he had left a legacy of hope and courage that would endure for generations to come.